Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Emma McCann, and I'm a partner in the Tax, Trust and Estates team here at Irwin Mitchell. I'm really pleased to be joined today by former RAF Flight Lieutenant and rugby legend Rory Underwood, who's going to host our event. In addition, I'm joined by my Irwin Mitchell colleagues, Sarah Balfour, a partner in the family law team, Jason Mountford, financial planner with Irwin Mitchell Asset Management, and last but by no means least, a fellow tax trust and estate specialist, Stuart Stretton-Hill. Today, we will be discussing the important topic of planning and preparing financially and legally for the future. It is fair to say that this past year has been challenging for us all and has generated an awful lot of uncertainty in people's lives. At the end of last year, and in conjunction with YouGov, Irwin Mitchell carried out a survey of more than 4,000 people to see whether the coronavirus pandemic had affected their attitude to planning for later life. The findings were mixed, and some responses were perhaps what we would expect to see from our own clients, but others were much more worrying and showed a real sense of people being unprepared or unsure what to do. So today, we're going to discuss some of the key points raised and give you our thoughts and top tips on the things you should be thinking about. Before we get started, a couple of things just to mention. We are running the webinar today in a question and answer format. So if you do have a question you wish to raise, please use the chat function. As we only have an hour, we may not get the opportunity to answer all the questions raised, but we will get back to you afterwards if you leave your email address after the question in the chat. And finally, as the webinar is being recorded, if you do have to leave for any reason, you will be sent an email in the next few days with the link to the full webinar. So we're now ready to kick off our discussion, and before I hand over to Rory formally, I'd just be interested to know what motivated you, Rory, to get involved with our event today, and whether any of the organisations you have represented in the past have ever given any support for life after rugby.
Hi Emma, good afternoon everyone. When I was approached by yourselves to get involved, it was actually quite interesting because I've just been through in the last couple of years some of the challenges of thinking about post-life for myself and my wife, but also for our respective parents, and thinking about care, living power of attorneys, lasting power of attorneys, and also having two daughters, very conscious about trying to pass on some of the best tips around what we should have done when we were 20, 21, whatever before. But as well, tied in as well, because of the rugby connection, it's interesting because of my time at Leicester Tigers around the challenge when you get to a certain end of career, are you thinking about it at the right time? All those things actually all resonated with me, so that's pretty much the main reason why I got involved. So, Emma, are we all done now with the domestics? I think if you just give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Brilliant.
Right.
Okay.
Yep. Over to you, Rory.
So, as I said, from my point of view, I've got personal experience about this, and some of the discussions I had with the team from Irwin Mitchell, as well as looking at some of the stats that came out of the presentation, the research. It was quite interesting. Some of it I sort of expected because having experienced myself, I know what it's like. But for others, it was a little bit of a surprise. And like anything else, it's sort of sometimes the question of where do you go and ask? Who do you ask? Who is the expert? Well, we've got a whole team of people here to come and help you with that regard. So rather than listen to me pontificate on for any more, I'm going to get into it. I'll regale some of my thoughts from it as we go through. So can we have the first slide, please? So one of the first things that came out of the research was that a fifth of over 55s have no retirement plans in place. So obviously the question is, are you one of them? So interesting, some of the facts that came out of this: a third of over 55s are retiring later or haven't made any plans. Now, whether that's due to the current COVID lockdown situation, whether that's impacting you, it remains to be seen. A fifth hadn't made any retirement plans about it at all. And some of the things that we'll be talking about, I suspect what'll come out of it is the whole context of what do you need in the context of when you want to retire. And obviously that's another question, when can you retire? 38% didn't know what income they needed to retire. Another interesting fact, when I reflect back and think about what we need, and when I first left the Air Force and I first set up a company, in the very early stages, we were looking at pension. And I can remember we sort of sat down and said, okay, well, when do we think we want to retire? How long do you think we're going to live for? Therefore, how much money do you want to live on a year? And then there's three of us that started the company. We sort of looked at it, times that, then times it by three. The figure was horrendous. And that really was quite an opener for quite a while ago. And it's something that's very been mindful of the sort of things you've got to think about. So in the whole context of that, when you've just read those facts out there, I'm going to come to Emma first. Did these results actually surprise you?
Yes and no. I mean, the findings, I think, certainly an indication that many people don't have enough saved up for retirement, or that they may be confused about what is required. They would definitely benefit, I think, from talking to a professional, whether that's a lawyer or a financial planner, just to see what options are available to them and to start things off. And I think what people don't necessarily realise is that planning for retirement not only involves assessing what income you might need to be able to retire on, but also putting plans in place in respect of making things like a will or a lasting power of attorney, and looking at how you pass your assets on to the next generation. People, making those sorts of documents, that they are the only way to ensure that you have put in place your preference as to what happens. And I think it's always better for people to plan for these scenarios rather than bury your head in the sand and just leave things to what the law says will happen, which may not be what you want to happen. And I think it's just important to get started, and as things change, you can review matters, but you just need to get on that bandwagon and start making these plans.
So in the context of getting on the bandwagon and whole context of, you mentioned independent financial advisors, etc. For some people, that can be quite a scary prospect. I mean, who do you go to, what you're looking for, and all the information. And of course, there's always sort of, well, who do I trust? What is a good IFA, etc. And obviously, the term independent should strike a chord. But still, I suspect there's still a challenge for some people to know, where do I go?
Absolutely. I mean, people will have contacts. There are ways to look at who are credited on various websites. Yeah. What we will do is, if obviously we are lawyers and people like Jason are financial planners, we will we will recommend, or we will suggest people that we know. If you can find one person, then the likelihood is that they have other contacts. Right. So that's why I think it's important to start somewhere.
Okay. Thank you, Emma. Jason, we'll come to you as a financial planner. So obviously I was bigging you up just then. I mean, the thing that stands out for me, as I said just now, my story about when you actually think about what income do I need, it's an interesting question, because you get so used to what you're earning now. Is that what you need in the future or not? Do you want to live to the lifestyle you want to or not? Do your costs and things change? It's an whole area that you sort of have to make a bit of a guesstimate about. So how do you go about in that context, and what do people have to think about, and how can you help?
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting one, and that is the biggest takeaway from me around this issue, is that 38% of people over 55 don't know what they need. And you've talked a bit there about a few different areas of life, whether it's your own personal financial situation, looking at the finances and the pension situation for your business, and I dare say you've been in similar situations in terms of your sporting life as well. And what all of that comes back to is understanding what your objectives are, understanding where you want to get. Because if you don't know where you're going with your plan, regardless of whether that's, like say, personal finances, your business, or your sporting ventures, you're not going to be able to know whether you're on track for that, or whether you need to adjust that plan as time goes on. So when it comes to finances, for me, the thing that I always stress and I always talk so much about is cash flow planning. And that's effectively a roadmap of what your financial future kind of looks like. Now, I love cash flow planning. I'm a bit of a cash flow planning nerd, so I got some slides that I knew I'd be able to get in at some point today, and I've managed to get them in on the first question, so you could bring those up. So this is just a really brief snapshot of the kind of thing that we do with clients. You can do something as simple as an Excel spreadsheet yourself, but it always comes back to the more detailed you can make your objectives, the more concrete you can put, concrete information you can put around what you want your life to look like, the better those outcomes are going to be. So for me, That's the big issue. Is number one, if you don't do anything else, start by working out what you want your life to look like, what you want that plan to look like, and then the finances, you can kind of work backwards from there.
I suppose the word that comes to mind and what I try and instill with my daughters is the sooner you start, even if it's a small amount, the better. Is that a fair?
Yeah, so definitely. And I think the key issue with that is the earlier you start, the less drastic those changes have to be, or those plans have to be. You know, I get clients coming to me who want to retire in 4 years' time and they've done no planning. And we can get them into a better position, but it's probably going to take some pretty drastic lifestyle changes, pretty drastic plans. If that same person had come to me when they were 35 or 40 or 45, it just means that you can have that same end goal, but you've got a lot longer to be able to get there, which means you can make it without having to sacrifice as much in the here and now.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So just to finish off then, if you could just summarise the two, sort of what your top tips are going to be. Just to reiterate as well for everybody, there's lots of questions, lots of expert advice and etc. All the nice little tips that we're going to put together in one document. I'll be sent out to everybody post this webinar. But yeah, Emma and Jason, just what were your top tips then out of what we've just been talking about? Emma, please.
I would say just to take that leap and do something, whether it be start with making a will or looking at a lasting power of attorney. Just start having those discussions, because the people that you go and see will then mention other things to you and help you progress along that road of being able to plan in full.
Well, okay, and Jason.
Yeah, so probably on similar lines to Emma, it's like I say, going back to those objectives. So sit down with your partner if you have one and really talk about what you want your life to look like. Because if you go and see someone, like Emma said, if you go and see someone and start that process, they're going to want to know how they can help you get to where you want to go. So if you don't know that bit, it's going to make the rest of it really difficult.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to the second fact here that came up from the survey. So has the pandemic changed your attitude to future planning? 72% of people said the pandemic hadn't made them reconsider planning for later life. Now, I mean, you know, I run a small business in the services sector in consultancy, and so the last year has been a very interesting time. There's been a lot of sitting and staring at the wall as you try and work out where the world is going, what's going to happen. So, you know, it's been a massive time of trying to reassess, where's the business going? Is it going to survive? Can I get through this? Has this impacted on my savings in the business? Never mind how for me as a small business in what I'm trying to cater for my later life as well. So all those things come into the context of trying to work out what we need to do. So from your perspective then, Stuart, I'm going to come to Stuart here. Why do you think people have focused on spending their savings, which seems to be what people are doing? So they're thinking of going on holiday because they've obviously hacked off from the lockdown, rather than necessarily thinking about retirement per se. Is that a sort of a psychological thing about spending the now, or what?
Thanks, Rory. Yes, I think you're right. I think the pandemic's done two things to people's mentality, really. The media's published figures every single day of the number of deaths due to COVID, and it's depressing, and it makes people think about their mortality, and that's at the forefront of our minds. And I think people's reaction to that is let's live in the here and now. Okay, we can't go abroad on holiday, but we can spend some time with family. We can take some time away from the office and just enjoy the here and now. The other thing it's done, I'm sure, is given people time to look at their job list, and pretty much everyone has on their job list make a will. It's a depressing thing to think about. You don't want to deal with it. It gets pushed down the list every single day. But I think because people are thinking about their mortality, because they're seeing the number of deaths in the media, and indeed professional medical organisations have been saying to their frontline staff right the way back in February, March last year, they were saying to the medics, look, get your will in place, make sure you've got arrangements, because the mortality rate for COVID is high, a lot higher than the usual winter flu and so forth. So I think that's focused people's minds on thinking, I've got to make a will. I've got to get plans in place in case I'm a victim of this pandemic. My concern about that is, while it's great people are planning, great people are thinking ahead to making a will, I don't think they're actually planning for the future. I think it's a reaction. People think, oh my goodness, there's this pandemic, there's a risk of me dying, I've got to make a will now. but they're not, as Jason and Emma both touched on, they're not thinking about the future. Actually, most people will survive through this pandemic. They should be thinking about retirement. They should be thinking about planning for a time when they retired from work and may want to provide for their children in the future. So I think it's a reaction rather than planning environment at the moment. And something I always say to people, it's really important. Great, you've made a will during this, but keep it under review. Make sure it's up to date. Make sure it's still relevant to your personal situation and circumstances.
Massively. I mean, I made a will when I first got married, and well, in fact, I think we did. But then when the kids came, we had to reassess it, and then as you go through life. So I think it's a very good point. You need to think and reassess about your will throughout the whole of your life as you get older. So from Sarah, from that point of view, I suspect it resonates with you from a family law perspective. What are your clients talking about with that regard as to thinking about the here and now and the future?
Yeah, well, Rory, that's a really interesting point. What I've seen with my clients, with family law clients, is that there's been an intensification of something that we call the bank of mum and dad, and that's something that's
exactly what you're talking about.
That's been growing in importance over the last few generations. And one of the interesting things about the way that family law has developed is this is probably our generation of young adults now is statistically the first generation that's created less wealth than the one that came before. And that's meant that our young adults now are reliant on parents and sometimes grandparents to do things that other generations took for granted. For example, getting on the housing ladder. So they're unable really to put down a deposit to buy a house themselves without that help from their parents. And that's a perfectly natural thing in order to help your children up the ladder. But that creates legal implications. And one of the things, if I take, for example, that putting a deposit down on a house as an example, it's a really good example, actually. Have you, as a parent, wanting to transfer assets to your child, have you thought about, do you want the money back? Is it a loan? Is it an investment? Because those two things are different. Or is it, as it will be in most cases, is it a gift that you want to pass to your children? And if it's a gift and your child has a partner, is it a gift to one of them or is it a gift to both of them? How would you feel if your partner and your child and the partner split up? Would you be happy for that partner to walk away with 50% of the deposit that you'd given? Is that something you'd be completely comfortable with, or not? And if you don't do anything, if you don't have that conversation, then that's what's going to happen. Most people who buy a property will buy it as what's called joint tenants, and if you've given a deposit to your child, that's not going to be protected within that arrangement, and their partner will potentially walk away with that 50%. Now, I'm not saying that that's the wrong thing to happen, but if you haven't thought about the implications, then you can't deal with them and it might come as a surprise. There are very simple things that you can do to protect yourself or your child in that scenario. If you decide that you want to lend them the money instead, a simple loan agreement, or even if you do want to gift your child that money, the couple can enter into a straightforward declaration of trust that protects what you're giving to your child, or they could enter into what's called a living together agreement or a cohabitation agreement, and that ring fences the gifts that are received from either families. So there's all sorts of straightforward practical things that you can think about and you can do. And for me, the really key thing, and it touches on something that Jason talked about, is that it is that plan. And again, Rory, the focus really is that one of the things I think that you can give your children is that ability to talk openly about the future and the ability to talk about money. And for me, that's really important.
I know, and it's a difficult one, isn't it? As we know, trying to talk money with kids. But there you go. Thank you for that, Sarah. So, Jason, coming quickly to you. Just, I mean, there's, if anybody knows watching on TV, the sort of proliferation of online trading and apps and all the things that are going on out there, and sort of you know, the ability to make money quick is obviously that sort of draw that they're trying to give you. But any top tips with regards to thoughts around how you try and get involved in that area?
So it's something that I have to say I was a bit surprised with this statistic, because like you say, there's been so much more news coverage on stock trading apps and investments and doing it yourself and all this. So I think we've seen a period where there's been a lot of potential opportunity. Markets have been very strong in the last 12 months, especially places like the US. I think with anything, it's very easy to get swept up in all the excitement of it. But I think if we're talking about longer term future planning like we are here, you know, it's important that you are doing those things, making your investments, making your choices, not as just as a reaction of what you're seeing in the news or getting excited, but with an eye on where you're trying to get to. What is the point of doing that? So I think that's the big one, is don't get swept up in the excitement. Think about why you're making the decisions that you're making. Yeah,
it's like there's just another facet to your tool to how you set yourself up for the rest of your life, isn't it, really? So brilliant.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you. So if we go to the next stat that came out of the survey, was around like anything else, you've got to be clear about where you actually are at the moment. It's like any journey, you've got to start at the beginning very clear about where you are. So are you clear about your finances? And that age-old question, what do you need for the future? The sort of stats that came out, that men over 40 are more likely to plan for retirement. A third of women didn't have any plans. 1/5 of women knew what funds were needed for retirement and how they would achieve it. So there's some interesting little facts there. So Jason, coming back to you from a financial planning, I mean, first thing that comes to mind is, I mean, why is there such a diverse view from men and women?
So I think it's quite common for one member of a relationship to or a couple to take the lead on financial matters. I think, you know, historically that has been men. That statistic there is for men over 40. So I think that's probably something that is changing as time goes on. But for me, the biggest issue with this one, and it's kind of reflective of what Sarah was saying at the last question, is that the biggest issue with this is that gap in communication and that gap of understanding. So, you know, there's a lot of talk about pensions gap for women and things like that. And when I'm looking at a couple's financial circumstances, the issue for me isn't normally that one person has more in their pension fund than the other one, because generally speaking, most couples going into retirement will be planning for that together. You know, there's not very many cases where you're in a long-term relationship where your finances are kept completely separately. So, you know, I think this is one of the areas where having those conversations is one of the best things that you can do for your finances. Now, that's easier said than done. You know, money is a very emotive topic, and I guess to toot my own horn a little bit, I think that's one area where a financial planner can add a lot of value that's not tangible. You know, it's not about your portfolio, it's not about your investment returns, but we can kind of be that person that sits in that meeting, make sure that everybody is heard. And again, going back to the objectives, make sure that everybody has a chance to say what's important to them and kind of what they see their future looking like. So yeah, I guess for me, to reiterate, that the big part here isn't about trying to equalize the pounds and pence of what's in column A and what's in column B for a couple, but just making sure that they're on the same page and they're both working towards the same objectives.
Which obviously is the ideal scenario of being on the same page and having the same objective. But as we know, sometimes couples do split up. And so going back to Sarah here, you sort of mentioned about the interesting challenges of money being passed down as gifts, and what happens if your daughter or son is married to or has a relationship with somebody else and they split up or whatever. There must be, I mean, are there ways of trying to either protect it or make sure it's, you know, sorted out in advance and avoid the sort of, you know, as you can imagine, the sort of carnage that could happen afterwards if it goes wrong in the context of couples that do split up?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Rory. I guess if you're thinking and you're planning for the future, what I always say to my clients is you're not planning to separate, you're not planning to divorce. You want and you plan to have a very happy relationship for the rest of your lives. But you've got to keep the possibility of separation within your thoughts and within your plans. And in the same way, nobody wants to die, they don't want to die early. It's something that may happen, and it's that planning for the unexpected and being able to cope with the unexpected that actually gives you a stronger platform on which to build. And I'd say the same is true about a relationship. If you have an open relationship, you talk about money, you talk about the possibility of having to separate out your pots in the future, and you take, as Jason said, if you take an active interest in your own finances, you know what's there in the matrimonial pot, then again, it gives you that information, it gives you that basis if the worst does happen and you separate. The reality is that if you're all divorcing, in many ways, as Jason mentioned, it doesn't necessarily matter in whose name a particular asset is, because things can be distributed between a couple. But having that basic knowledge about what you need for the future is key. And when you know what you need for the future, that makes it more likely that a separating couple will take an amicable and constructive approach, because even in separation, if you're able to work together, then there are lots of tax effective and constructive steps that you can take that mean your eventual outcome is better. And where a couple have children, and again, Rory, as we talked about, if you want to pass wealth on to those children, again, taking a constructive approach to your separation can help everybody, can help the whole family.
Yeah, brilliant, Sarah. Some good steps taking place. Anything like that, I think getting it legally sorted out beforehand, which is a sometimes difficult conversation, but it's one of those things, just in case, is something you don't want to think of as hindsight. So moving on to the next stat that came out of the research. Now this talks about I suppose your mindset you're in now. So what motivates you to plan for your future? Do you know what you need to do in that context? Married couples or those with children are more likely to have planned for retirement, and 40% of adults aged 40 plus who have never been married hadn't planned for retirement. So, I mean, what comes across to me from that perspective is that whole sort of sense of what your certain situation is and what you're thinking about for the future. For me, it was very much anonymous. We had 2 daughters. We were very conscious about trying to make sure that we planned with our wills what would happen. And to a certain extent, we did the LPA as well, both from looking after our parents, but also on us two, my wife and I, as well as the kids being involved in the conversation, so they knew what our thoughts or our plans were. And so we made sure that they were very comfortable with our thoughts were. I mean, we very much took a decision that rather than you're going to get anything when we peg it, you can have it now, helping with as Sarah was talking about earlier on, about helping with house and the bank of mum and dad. And actually one of our concerns for the future is if we do have to go into care, do we plan for it so that we help to pay for it rather than the kids having to pay for it, which is something to bear in mind. So coming to those sort of things, it says, are they worrying for you as such, Emma, or are they just stats that sometimes people just are, I mean, when I say ignorant, I mean just not aware of, I suppose, is probably the correct way of saying it. So what sort of things are you seeing with your clients and out there in the general situation at the moment?
I think that what we often see is that people come to talk to us after they've had a traumatic life event, so
Right.
something such as an illness or a family bereavement. So in the same sense, it does follow that positive milestones such as marriage or having children would also prompt people to come forward and discuss these issues. I think the reason for that is because they make you think about more than just yourself, and make you think about your loved ones, your family, your friends, your children. And at those key stages, that's obviously, a natural milestone for considering, your financial position and where things are going. I mean, other natural milestones such as a child going to school or university or leaving home, again, they're the same sorts of things that can prompt somebody to want to have a look at everything and see where things are going. I mean, the thing that does concern me, Rory, though, from these statistics is that just because someone isn't having those same milestones, we don't want to see people left behind.
Yes.
Because that is obviously a big concern. And it might be that people maybe don't feel comfortable in trusting others if they're on their own and talking about financial matters. And I think if that is the case, then it's even more important that they do go and speak to a professional, and they start having those conversations, because it can seem overwhelming and daunting at first. But if you start those conversations, a professional will help you break it down into more sort of bite-sized pieces and be able to deal with one thing at a time.
Definitely.
And I think one thing that we do see a lot of is that family situations and people's lives are becoming more and more complicated. The structures are becoming more complicated, and actually that means that legally it makes it more complicated. So it's actually even more important, you know, if you, for example, you live together rather than you're married, you know, it's even more important that you consider things like a will, because things might happen if you don't have a will that aren't what you would have wanted. And just lastly, just before I finish this bit, there are some common myths out there that people don't understand. So they might hear a term like next of kin, and they might think, oh, well, such and such is my next of kin, that means they can deal with everything for me. But actually legally that doesn't mean anything. And the only way that you can appoint someone to either manage your affairs during your lifetime or after your death is to make a will or a lasting power of attorney. So it's, you know, there are things out there that people misunderstand or don't completely understand, which it would just be really useful for those people to have conversations.
I could definitely vouch for that, you know, having been through the LPA process and realising that, you know, there's a financial one and a health one was one of the first learnings I had. So that made life easier. So we both had, my wife and I had a very deep, you know, frank discussion around the health situation, what we want to do, if this happens, that happens, whatever. And the whole context of wills, at the end of the day, you know, we kept asking, can we do this? Can we? You can do whatever you like. That's the whole point of a will. You lay out exactly what you want to happen, and by doing that, it becomes legal. Whereas if you leave it to the next of kin and a discussion that was had 20, 30 years ago, and they made that comment then, you know, that becomes a whole different ball game altogether. So I very much understand that. And so, I mean, from that point of view, Sarah, coming back to you in the whole context of family law, etc., you know, we've talked about divorce and marriage and splitting up, but obviously you have a situation where there's more and more people that live together now, and just couples who may live for a short period of time or a long period of time and then split up, and they may have a house or kids or whatever. So what are the ramifications from all that?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, Rory. And actually, when, as with Emma, myth busting on the idea of next of kin, there's this very persistent myth of a common law spouse. The idea that if you're in a relationship for a certain number of years, you live together under the same roof for a certain period of time, then you become like a spouse, and you obtain rights and responsibilities akin to marriage. But actually that's not the case at all. You know, you could potentially, if you live in a property that is in the legal name of your partner, even if you live in it for 20, 30 years, you've raised children in the house together, if you don't have a legal interest, your name's not on the documents, then actually you could potentially walk away from that relationship with just the clothes on your back. So that the law doesn't have the sorts of the ability, as I talked about before, about redistributing wealth between a married couple on a divorce. The law just doesn't have the ability to do that if you're unmarried. And for me, actually, that's a really important distinction between a couple who live together but aren't married and a couple who are married. And again, it's not about there being a right answer and a wrong answer. There's no morality when I speak to my clients from that perspective, but it's the lack of understanding of the implications of the decision that you're making. So for me, it's really, really important to obtain as much information as you can, think through your options, and the implications of what you're deciding. And that's the key, really. If you don't have the information, there could be unintended consequences from tax, or from inheritance, as Emma talked about, unintended consequences of decisions that you're making.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. I mean, for me, the one thing that really stood out for me, and the reason why I definitely went into it, but in my situation, is the factor about you think that just because you're married and have been married for 20, 30 years, but if your spouse is doesn't die, but actually goes into a coma or becomes incapacitated, actually the realization that it's not as simple that everything you can decide what you can do for her, and those sort of things really struck home to me. And the whole context, that's really why I got into making sure I got some LPA sorted out for both of us. So very, very interesting thoughts that really need discussion. So I'm conscious of the time, so if we move on to number 5, please. And this one is very much about how do we be cared for in later life and how do we pay for? And, you know, let's face it, we're all getting an aging population. Our average age is getting, for people dying, is getting higher and higher. The amount of people that are being allocated as being in the dementia bracket is getting bigger and bigger, and the care is not getting any cheaper. And so the whole aspect of here, a quarter of people would accept higher taxes to fund later life, which is quite interesting, but you sort of think it's only 25%. I mean, who's going to pay for it later on? And then the majority of people have no clue what policies would help. And again, it's just trying to understand what them potentially, because I've got a rough idea, but if I go into care, how much does it cost? If the kid's got to look after it, who's going to pay for it? And honestly, if the state doesn't take care of it. So these are all very interesting and thought-provoking questions. So Stuart, what do we have to think about, and what do we have to, really think about how we help our offspring for later life?
How long have you got? Really?
Well, I know, I can imagine.
there is so much to think about, and people, I think the main issue is people don't know what questions to ask. The age-old interview question is where do you see yourself in 5, 10, 15 years is actually perfect for this sort of scenario. Most people, again, just react rather than plan. I mean, the sort of the surprises, the things that people ask me most of all, one of the biggest questions I'm asked is, how can I protect my house or estate against being used to pay for care fees? That's the wrong question, really, because there's a big difference between what the state will pay for in terms of your care and what you can purchase with private care. The state local authority has a duty to provide and assess your care needs, but it can actually be very, very different to what you want to receive. We often hear about cases where local authorities carers come in for a visit for an hour or so a day. They might come in at 10 o'clock in the morning to wake you up and get you out of bed, and then come back at 5 o'clock to give you supper and put you back to bed. I mean, no one wants to live like that. So I really think people should change their view from thinking about how do I protect my assets, how do I not use them, but actually plan on how to get the best care possible. And there's always that great plan. Again, it's the man down the pub who suggests this wonderful idea of transferring your house to your children to protect it from having to pay for care. That is not the simple fix that a lot of people think it is. It's fraught with difficulties. The biggest risk is if you give your house away to your child, you've given it away. You've got no rights in that property anymore. And if your child gets divorced or is declared bankrupt, that is their asset. Your house could be taken away to settle their debt. And it can also have major negative inheritance tax consequences that people just don't think and don't realise are there. And in addition, it might not work. The local authority may still say, actually, we're going to treat you as still owning that property or that money. It may just not be successful in protecting anything from having to pay for care fees. Another big surprise that we've already talked about, Emma mentioned about the idea of next of kin. It doesn't exist. I always say to people, look, make a power of attorney so someone can actually take decisions on your behalf. Otherwise, in terms of care, it's up to the local authority. They are the decision maker. They get to decide where you should live, whether you go into a care home, whether you get care at home. And that's not something I like. I don't want the local authority taking decisions over me. So health and welfare power of attorney, definitely something people should put into place. And another big topic again is care homes. If care at home is not a possibility, moving into a care home is a likelihood. And a misconception here as well is that the care home contract is like a mobile phone contract. You take it or leave it, really. But actually, that's not the case. You can push back, you can negotiate. But I think my biggest bit of advice to people there is, for goodness sake, if you've got a relative moving into care, take advice on that contract. I mean, I can't think of any other case where someone would sign up to paying 40, 50, 60,000 pounds a year for care fees without taking legal advice on that. But people do, because it's a distressed purchase. They think, oh God, if I don't sign up now,
Right.
we're going to lose the bed. So yeah, overall, you mentioned the idea of what should the government do. I mean, they mooted the idea last year about increasing taxes for those over the age of 40. Given I am over the age of 40, I'm not sure I like the idea of that, but there we go. Something has to be done, frankly. We did a report in conjunction with Centre for Economic and Business Research last year that basically said the social care system will probably be broken by about 2029 unless the government takes action. Fact is, we've got the pandemic. It's putting great pressure on the public purse. If the government's not taking action, it's up to us as individuals to do so and plan well in advance.
Very true. Good point there. And so from that point of view, Jason, just to finish off with a couple of quick minutes here, from a financial planning, what can you do? I mean, nobody planned for the COVID, etc. And of course, what is that figure we're going to have to do? But what can we do to try and help ourselves to make sure we're in a better place?
So, I mean, I guess in a lot of ways, I'm going to reiterate what Stuart was saying. There are lots of things you can do. There are different financial products you can consider that'll help pay for care. There's obviously different ways you can access, your pensions, your ISAs, whatever, to make sure that you're taking money in a tax effective way. But all that centres around you having some funds to be able to do that. So, just like Stuart, a lot of clients come to me when they're thinking about care and to a lesser extent inheritance tax, and basically saying, how do I get rid of all my money? And that is just the worst attitude to be looking at. It's all of us can get a house for free if we don't have enough money. There's council houses available for people who can't afford them themselves, but we don't aspire to that because it doesn't give us the choice and the flexibility and the freedom around it. And in my opinion, that's exactly the same with care. So again, all comes down to planning. Plan for inheritance tax, plan to pass your assets on to your children if you can afford to do that. But the priority should still be to make sure that you have enough money left to live a life that you want and a life that's acceptable to you.
I see. Just hearing you saying that, as much as you'd like to think we're all intelligent compass mentors, got to be able to add two and two together. But if you think about everything you just said there, it's a massive whole concept to actually think about. And so, getting proper advice and help is crucial to make sure you get that done right. Because if you don't, it's not going to be done as well as it could be. I think that's fair enough to say, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. I agree.
Brilliant. Okay, so there's the 5 sort of stats that we've sort of had a look at, and we've had the experts, but we've had some questions that have come in. Anyway, still just keep finding the questions in, because if we don't have the time and we run out, the questions will be taken on board and the experts will answer those and get pushed out later after we finish the webinar. So heads up. So Sarah, I'm coming to you. I had a question here. I have a new partner and we want to get married. I want to protect my children if we split up. What can I do? And we've touched on this already, but it'd be interesting just to hear directly that situation.
We have that's a really interesting question, and it's very important. There is something that you can do if you decide you want to get married to your new partner. You may want to enter into what's called a prenuptial agreement or a premarital agreement, because once you get married, the assets, even those that you've brought into the relationship, so for example a house or a pension or all sorts of things that you bring in, they're not automatically ring fenced within your new marriage. So particularly if you want to protect your children, you want to be able to leave those assets to your children, you can enter into this prenuptial agreement, and that will in many cases have the impact of ring fencing and protecting those for your children. It's also important, and I'm sure Stuart and Emma would talk about this, it's really important to update your will, because marriage will revoke an existing will unless it's made with that marriage in mind. So it's really important that if you enter into a prenuptial agreement, that reflects your will and the two documents work together. One of the things that in fact Jason mentioned when he was answering your question before, Rory, is about that taking up a joined up approach, and it's exactly the same. So if your life circumstances are changing because you're getting remarried, think about what happens in lifetime and potentially on death, and the prenup will update could work really, really well for you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Sarah. Stuart, very short, simple question. What should you do if your parent or parents don't have a will?
Short and simple, I like it. Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, I suppose the age-old adage is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. I think that the point is it's getting to the root cause. Why don't they have a will? What is stopping someone from making a will? Is it that just down that job list? Do they just not want to think about it? People don't want to talk about death, frankly, and I think there is the psychological feeling is once you're prepared for death, you're going to die. I think a lot of people have that feeling. So it's certainly encouraging parents. It's a difficult conversation to have, but you can flip it round and say, do you really want to leave a mess behind? Every parent wants to do the best they can for their child. So putting a proper, well-worded, well-thought-out will and plan, retirement plan, care plan in place is the best thing you can do for your children, frankly. They know what your plans are. There's less likely to be a dispute. I think one of the best bits of advice I've ever heard given to a client is never let your will be a surprise. Talk about it with the family, particularly if it's going to do something slightly unexpected. As I say, it's not a pleasant conversation to have when you're alive, but it's a very difficult conversation to have when you're dead. So,
and I suppose, sorry, I suppose it's a situation that they're a generation probably that just assumed if they die, it just gets passed on normally, which, as we know, is not quite as simple as that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the intestacy rules have changed a lot over the years. There is that myth that everything goes to the spouse. There is that myth that everything goes simply to the children. But what a lot of people don't realise is actually there's a lot of assets that don't pass on to your will. So pension pots, insurance, death in service benefit, all these things do not necessarily just follow the terms of the will. So people really take a very, very rounded approach to their estate planning, know what they own, and have that conversation.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Stuart. Jason, when you change job and go to a new company, should you transfer your old job's pension into the new company scheme? This must be a conversation you have a lot of the time with regards to pensions and which is the best, what should I do? Should I pot them all together, spread them out, whatever? There must be a whole raft of things you can talk about here.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess starting point is it's always good to have things as consolidated as possible. The worst thing is when people think, I remember I had a pension with a company I worked for 10 years ago, but I can't remember who it was with, and the company doesn't exist anymore. And so keeping things as well managed and consolidated as possible is a good thing. But I will say that it shouldn't be the automatic thing that you do is when you change jobs, transfer your pension. And the reason for that is because especially with company pensions, with occupational schemes, they're all completely different. A lot of them will have the a lot of similarities, but there can be special individual benefits built into there, especially if they're maybe slightly older schemes that you've had for a while. And sometimes by just blindly transferring them, you could end up actually losing out on some of those features that you had in that scheme. So number one, yes, consolidate if that's the right thing to do. But number two, before you do that, really have a good look at the scheme and make sure you're not going to be losing anything by doing that. If you're not sure about it, err on the side of caution and either speak to someone like myself or speak to a professional about what you might lose if you transfer, or if you're really not sure, you're probably better safe than sorry, and just leaving things where they are. But like I say, consolidation is definitely where you should aim to be eventually.
Okay, thank you. Interesting. Emma, I'm going to come to you about a question about wills. And it's quite interesting as I've read the question. I've heard of a situation, somebody I know who actually wanted to put something in the will for something not to happen. And it was quite interesting because that's what a will's there for, not just what you want to happen, but something that you don't want to happen, as in passing money to a certain person or whatever. And so the whole context, how should I plan my will in a family with stepchildren on both sides? Interesting already. We want to ensure that the money and house first goes to each other, but can we have something legally binding that means when whoever dies second, the estate passes to all the stepchildren as planned, and one side of the family cannot be cut out of the will if there was an unexpected fallout?
Well, that sort of situation, I mean, I mentioned earlier on about how people's lives are becoming more complex. That sort of situation is so common these days. And it is absolutely imperative that you make a will, because if you make a will, you can actually deal with that. And what you can do within the terms of the will is you can have a trust arrangement which means that you can ring fence each partner's individual assets for their own children while still allowing the other party either to live in a property or to have access to those assets. And it means that you're not going to end up with a situation where somebody's children potentially are completely left out. If you didn't make a will in these circumstances, then the likelihood is that the assets would pass to the children of the person that died last, and therefore potentially leaving out the children of the first party to die. So it's absolutely crucial in that situation that you look at making a will, and you can have those arrangements within the will to address exactly what you're concerned about.
Yeah, and all the questions, I mean, I remember when I sat down and did a will again recently, ask any question you want, and the answer was always about, you can have what you like in the will, you decide what you want to put in, and decide which way you want the money to go.
Absolutely, absolutely. You can put whatever you like in a will, and you just have to come up with, you have to think about, what I always say to people when they're making wills is, what is it that you're trying to achieve? Tell us what you want to do, and then we will look at the best way and the most tax efficient way to go about doing that.
Exactly.
So yes, you just need to think about what it is that you intend and what you want to happen with your assets and what your major concerns are, and then we will work out a way to do that.
Brilliant. Okay, the next one probably is going to come to you. Get back again, Emma and Sarah, but I'll go to Sarah, then Emma, you can add as you wish. How do you protect a child by having a guardian in place in case both parents die, in order to avoid a family member automatically stepping up? And how would the child's inheritance be managed by the guardian?
Okay, so I'll leave it to Emma to talk about the financial and inheritance aspects, but it's really important from a family law perspective that you think about, if you were to pass away, who the guardians for your children up to the age of 18 would be. The default is that if you have two parents, and one of them passes away, the default is that the other parent, as long as they have what's called parental responsibility, will step in and will be legal guardian for the children. But actually there are some circumstances in which that wouldn't be appropriate. So a parent who hasn't been involved in the day-to-day care of a child, or hasn't been around for some reason, and in that situation it's really important to appoint a guardian, to tell that guardian that you're appointing them, and to give some explanation and some careful thought as to why they would be the appropriate person to step in. And having those conversations sometimes can be difficult if you've got many members of family that you're close to, and they think that they would be the most appropriate person. But it's similar to what Stuart was saying about your will. Although they're difficult conversations to have in life, the consequence of not having those discussions is a lot worse. So it's all about making decisions, explaining the rationale for those decisions, and communicating them in a is very, very important. Emma, what do you think about inheritance?
Well, so what I would say in relation to that is that what Sarah was saying there about appointing a guardian, absolutely, you can appoint a guardian within a will. You can actually appoint guardians, you could appoint one person, if something happens to that person, appoint someone else. It's a very, very common thing for people to do that, and we would always recommend that people do appoint guardians within a will if they have children under the age of 18 years. In relation to the inheritance, what we would suggest is that you appoint trustees to manage the children's money. They could be the same people as you have as guardians, but that's not something that we'd necessarily recommend, simply because the guardians might be perfect to look after the children, doesn't mean that they've got necessary skills to look after the money. It adds an extra layer of protection for the money by having separate people for those two jobs. So they're all things that can be done through the will, but you just need to give that some real thought as to who are the most appropriate people for those particular roles. Okay,
thank you, Sarah and Emma. And I'm going to finish off with which I suspect it will be, within reason, a short answer, because a lot of the stuff we've been talking about is quite detailed. But Jason, just coming back to you, if you've got somebody in their 20s, I mean, we've been talking to a lot of people in their 50s and 60s, whatever, and doing it too late. But if you're in your 20s, what should you be doing with pensions and for later life generally? What's the best thing they can do now, which have the biggest bang for buck?
Biggest bang for buck is just starting to learn about it all. So education, signing on to things like this, reading books about investments, understanding what's going on with the budget each year. But other than that, it's just starting to do something. So if you've got a pension, pay attention to where it's invested, start to put a little bit of money in each month. Doesn't have to be a lot, just enough for you to be engaged with it. The only thing I would say is start planning for these things, start thinking about retirement later life, but don't go crazy. You know, the last thing you want to be doing is piling all of your money into your pension scheme when you're 22, and then a few years down the track you've got a couple of kids, which, as you know, Rory, are very, very expensive, and you're wishing that you hadn't put all that money into your pension, which you can't now get out. So start doing it, but don't go crazy.
Brilliant. Okay, well, can I thank all the experts on behalf of everybody that's listening at the moment. It's been very interesting. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that I've had to do recently, so I've sort of, you know, I'm aware of, etc. But still, there's always some little nuances that you're picking up and stuff. And not my situation, because with stepchildren and various other things, there's been interesting some stuff in there. But there's been a lot of very interesting thing that's come out of it. And I'm sure from those sort of things, I think what resonated with me are things like get an expert, get people to help you with planning through the minefield. The earlier you can start, the better. And even with that one, the opposite is, even if it's potentially too late, you could argue it's probably never too late. You still should think about it and do something. From a legal perspective, there's loads of opportunities there to do either your wills, your LPAs, or whatever that can help get things sorted out for you. Should you pass away? Should you go into care? Should you need any help? And how you pass things on. And you know, I wouldn't even start talking about tax. Just get somebody to help you and advise you on tax, because there is, I'm not going to say loopholes, but obviously ways of making sure the money transfers efficiently. Is that probably the best way of saying? I think Sarah, I'm not even, but various. So from that point of view, hopefully I've managed to pave the way through this, and everybody's found it interesting, and I've asked some of the questions that you've all wanted to hear. Again, if they haven't, please put your question to the team through the process, and we'll gather all those up and push them back out to you. I've done my stint now. I'm going to keep quiet now because we want to make sure we wrap up within an hour. So the last few minutes, I'm going to hand back to Emma. And again, can I just thank all the experts for all your advice? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory, and thank you very much for hosting this event for us today. It's been really interesting to hear what you've picked out of the event personally, even though you obviously have dealt with this fairly recently. It's always useful to hear different perspectives and hear different tips from different people. So hopefully everyone that's been on the webinar today has been able to pick up something that they're able to use in the future and to help them with their own planning. So just to finish off, it just remains with me to say that there will be an email sent out within the next couple of days, which will include a recording of this session, some top tips information, and also some contact details for everyone that's been involved today. If you have a specific question which we haven't been able to answer, we will get back to you directly if you've left us your email address, so please do that. We're also always very, very keen to hear feedback on the webinars that we do and whether or not this is the sort of thing that people want to hear more about. So there is a link in the chat box for feedback. If you are able to assist us with that, that's always very welcome. So thank you very much for your time today. I hope you've all found it useful, and have a good afternoon.